Hello, listeners of the Mad Scientist podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cogswell, here this week with another in our series of interviews with folks who are, in my mind, kind of the important people in the UFO field that you should be hearing. So today we're joined by MJ Banias. MJ is an educator, writer, blogger, terra obscura there. I wrote the book, The UFO People, A Curious Culture. Also just, fire tweets, writing for Vice recently on these kinds of subjects and things. And overall, I think just voice of reason in the UFO community. So MJ, how are you?
I'm terrific. Thanks very much for having me. And I appreciate you calling me the voice of reason. It's really enjoyable.
No problem. It's good news, man. Yeah, there's not many. There's not many in this field right now. So it's nice to have someone who kind of tells things straight, So, MJ, the reason I wanted to have you on, so obviously we're doing a series right now on kind of the history of Robert Bigelow and his associates in the UFO field. So, all the way from Bigelow's really kind of early days with this stuff, his first encounter or his family's first encounter with a UFO, to Pudov's work within SRI and his time in Scientology, and then John Alexander, all the stuff, right? All the things, essentially.
Yeah, all of the things. Yeah,
all the things.
There's a lot of things.
The challenge, though, I think, for listeners is putting all of this in context of kind of the culture, the overall culture of the UFO subculture.
Right.
It's really hard to kind of understand. And I think it's because really, it's funny. I was rereading The Fourth Kind, the book about the MIT conference on abductions. And, in that book, they make the case that conference was a perpetual split in the research community between the kind of positive view of abductions and the negative view of abductions. And I'm reading that today and I'm like, that was not the fundamental split. Like the split, sometimes it feels like the split is like three people against millions of groups of other kind of triads of people. So in your mind, I guess, what are the predominant... Well, first off, let's start from the beginning. How did you get interested in this stuff?
Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, what we're literally talking about is, I think, is why I got interested. My university background in English literature is predominantly in culture studies. So I've got a degree in English, with a focus on culture studies and history and philosophy. So my academic interest is really how it all began. I'm fascinated by how subcultures form and how communities sort of gather together to create ideas. So my interest in sort of the UFO community was purely academic in the very beginning. I was incredibly interested in talking to these people because they kind of all hover around one sort of key idea, at least I thought at the time. And it was, about flying saucers and aliens. And I thought it sort of was quite compelling from an academic standpoint. And then I have to be honest, as years went by of sort of living within sort of the paranormal world, and interviewing people, talking to people, investigating sightings, working with all of these different individuals, I quickly sort of realized how varied it was, and at times like totally insane, and at times perfectly rational and reasonable. And it just kind of started there. I kind of became just a member of that world, and here we are today.
Yeah, it's a funny, I think, way. Your introduction to this and your writings always remind me of the first time I went to a MUFON meeting.
Right.
I kind of sat down and I brought, I had like my laptop and all this stuff and, way over prepared for this meeting.
Right.
And I get in and it's just kind of a group of people who are friendly, talking about weird stuff, enjoying each other's company and everything else. And I sit down to this an older woman, right, probably in her, I don't know, mid to late 70s. And I asked her, well, what brings you here? And she told me, well, I just like to hang out and look at the people.
Right.
And I was like, Interesting. It's kind of a very similar, I think, view to kind of how, I don't know, how you got involved here, right? It's the people that are the interesting part.
Yeah. I mean, there's, like I said, from a subcultural perspective, I walked in thinking that this was going to be like any other subculture, right? But I was interested in. I mean, I'm a nerd, and I love sort of Star Trek, and I love the X-Files as a kid, and so for me, it was interesting from a content perspective, and then it was also interesting from an academic perspective, and just the notion of a subculture and what I was so used to studying, reading about, and focusing on in my university coursework. So I got into it, and I quickly realized that the content was incredibly fascinating to me, but how quickly people fell down sort of the ideological slope of previous sort of iterations of the subcultural ideas, and how you have this repetition in the community of ideas that kind of just circulate over and over and over again, and they kind of repeat themselves over and over and over again. It just depends on the decade, right? Like, history kind of circles around the UFO, and you have similarities across the decades of what's happening. And UFOs are just this weird little idea. It's like a MacGuffin, right? For this subculture. I don't know. It was purely academic at first, and then I kind of fell in love. Yes.
Yeah, it's the history, from an academic standpoint, it's hard not to see. So when I was at university, I took a class on Marxism, on Marxism and culture.
Right.
And it was, this class was, people in the philosophy department talked about this being one of the hardest capstone classes you could take. Both because of just the amount of work you had to do is like intense, very, very intense in terms of writing and reading, but also because it would make you question everything you thought about everything up to that point.
Yeah.
So, the most ardent, what's the word? The most ardent, philosopher of mind, would go into this course thinking that they knew what they thought the world was, and then they'd leave being like, "Oh my God, it's all been bought and sold to me."
That's right.
And the UFO field to me it's always struck me as a really great microcosm or a really interesting microcosm of sort of that same kind of almost Adorno, Horkheimer cultural industry argument.
Yeah.
Every generation, we're just kind of making it. In some ways, the cyclical stories are interesting, but there's always something a little bit different about each one, and it makes me wonder if it's not just like a society's way, almost, of a certain subset of getting themselves used to the idea that the government lies to us, and your life is out of your control, and people are uncomfortable with that. But this is a way to confront those anxieties in kind of a nice set. They serve coffee and cake at the MUFON meetings.
Right.
So it's an easy way to confront those fears.
Sure. I think you're right to a point. I think that I would even, we could probably move this outside of sort of economics and politics, right? We could move it into just the condition of being human, right? We post-Enlightenment, right, we walked around, and we still walk around, kind of thinking we're the masters of our domain, right? Humans are the top of the food chain. We're the only species that can sort of manipulate the environment around it to make it easier for us to survive. We develop technology, whatever. So from a strictly human perspective, post-Enlightenment, we had this idea that humans are the peak and the best. Let's say creature on this planet, or living organism, whatever, right? The most rational, the most logical, the most intelligent. But life isn't like that, right? We quickly realized, life does not function on this principle, right? In fact, we're quite susceptible to death, and we're quite susceptible to chaos, and we're quite susceptible to a universe that's very unkind and doesn't necessarily give a crap as to our ability. It will destroy us anyway. People still die, we still get sick, so this constant post-Enlightenment battle of human versus nature, right? Where we're trying to govern the world around us, and she refuses to be governed in a sense. So I think what's really interesting about UFOs as a strictly kind of human project is that they're a sort of a symbolic manifestation of this battle between us and nature, or us and the world around us. We're constantly struggling with our own survival, and UFOs act as a sort of perhaps guide for some people, or a symbol of a messianic kind of salvation, or a symbol of invasion and death, right? Something we must fight against, another aspect of nature we have to go to war with. Like there's you can kind of go down a lot of paths here, but UFOs are a modern iteration of sort of any monster story. From ancient times, right? This constant kind of social battle we engage in with ourselves and our own frailty and mortality. And then you tie in the politics, and then you tie in the economics, and then you tie in the cultural, and it just kind of staggers and becomes so nuanced, and it's almost impossible to totally deconstruct the UFO community or the UFO narrative or the UFO discourse. It's really, I think, impossible, but it's fun to try and do it because we can get to some interesting academic places with it, I think.
Absolutely. Well, it's one of my biggest, I think, frustrations. Even, I mean, there is a plethora of books and lectures and things that touch on this kind of subject without getting into it explicitly. And one of, I think, in my mind at least, one of the most interesting links that can be made between, say, the modern day UFO subculture and previous iterations of this same kind of idea, like you're hinting at, is the demonological, or kind of the, witchcraft trials,
Sure.
Because, again, it's a lot of the same, even some of the stories are the same, a guy going into a courtroom saying, Sister Mary came into my room last night flying on a broomstick and took me out of the room to a wooded area for the witch's Sabbath. And I saw bright lights, and I heard the whirring of winds. Exactly. Right. And then I came back to bed and I woke up as if nothing happened.
Right.
Even in those situations, right, these stories don't, like we say on the show a lot, these stories don't really change. They just kind of change flavor.
Well, yeah. I mean, the cultural reality from which sort of the viewer or the experiencer, let's say, exists is going to influence their interpretation of, let's say, an event, right?
I think of this as almost a very interesting test subject or test case area for a lot of these ideas in philosophy and psychology and sociology and anthropology and whatever, of how a subculture forms, and how to me, in school, in philosophy classes, the most interesting question was always, why do people believe the wrong thing?
Sure.
Do you know what I mean? Like, if there's a choice between A and B, and there's loads of evidence on the side of A, why do some people still choose to believe B?
Right.
Or maybe not choose is the wrong word. Why do some people still believe B, even in the face of all of the evidence of A? And when I was in school, that was mostly focused on the idea of technology, right? Why do some people not believe in climate change? Why do some people not, why does my grandma think that the president of the United States is trying to ruin her life by installing more efficient light bulbs? Right? That's an interesting question to me. The UFO field is almost a perfect microcosm of that in its most extreme. It's like a perfect example of that. One of my biggest frustrations is, why aren't there more academics doing research on these subjects or in these areas, even from just a sociological
I think
standpoint?
there are. I mean, when you look at, the papers on academia, like that website, right, that edu, like the one where you can download papers all the time. You have tons of research being done on UFOs from a sociological perspective. I think there's something like 5 PhD dissertations a month on the UFO subject. So the research is being done. What isn't happening is you aren't seeing that research making a connection with the community itself, right? So these individuals who do their studies don't really exist within the UFO community, not like you and I do, right? They hover outside of it. They pop in and out every once in a while. They visit the occasional conference just to sort of see what people are up to. They read the books, they write their dissertation, and then they walk away. And very few choose to stay within this world, right? They don't fall into it. Because I think they realize very quickly, just like, you and I have realized, is that there's a lot of drama within the UFO community, right? And it's just not worth it. You take someone like Dr. Diana Pasulka, right, who is very much engaged, or was engaged rather, in the UFO community, but has since walked away after publishing her book, because her book came out and she drew significant ire from members of the community, because she was labeled as a disinformation agent, she was labeled as a patsy of some intelligence agency, she was labeled as this or that. Some of it was very unkind and personal. She received death threats. So as an academic, right, as someone who has, a fairly reasonable level of education, you realize that type of behavior does not exist in your world, because, people would be removed from it. But that doesn't happen in the UFO community, right? It sort of continues to exist. So I don't think academics really want to hang around in the UFO community because of the climate. Because of how negative it is, because how it often just devolves to ad hominem attacks, it's fun to say, ad hominem attacks, and that's fine. So I don't necessarily blame them, but I agree with you. I think there should be more study of the phenomenon, of the community, of the subculture, for sure.
Yeah, what's kind of funny, I think, is there's this view that there's the view in the UFO community itself that academics don't get interested in this. And then the ones that do are, like you said, pillared pilloried rather, just attacked and, whatever. And then, it kind of brings to mind this idea that, the UFO community doesn't really want academic discussion or dissection of their field. What the UFO community wants is a scientist to get on TV and say, yes, I believe in aliens. they want confirmation.
I think you actually hit the nail on the head, because unfortunately with any academic study, any sort of rigorous examination, you're going to fundamentally get to a point where you're going to say, this idea is correct or closer to being correct, and this idea is not correct or closer to being not correct, right? You're going to have to start drawing lines depending on your research, as to what's sort of accurate, what's not accurate. And unfortunately, within the UFO community, it's so varied, right? The ideologies are so varied. They're all over the place. You're going to have people disagreeing with each other, yet they're still part of the same community, right? It's the funniest thing when you walk into something like Contact in the Desert, and in one room, like Jacques Vallée is giving a lecture, and in the other room, Corey Goode's giving a lecture, and the two of which their entire understanding of the UFO phenomenon, or their entire method of let's say selling or speaking about the UFO phenomenon, is so fundamentally diametrically opposed to one another, that they could never have a conversation. Right? Like they could just never have a conversation about what UFOs are in any serious or rigorous sense, because they come from two opposing discourses of what UFOs are, right? Vallée would say that this is some sort of, metaphysical intelligence, that sort of has been with us since forever, and it influences us in some mystical way. And Corey Goode's going to tell you, well, no, man, like I've been to Mars and I fought the aliens and they're flesh and blood like me. In fact, I shot them, and there's reptilians, and they're like, it would be like, what the hell are you talking about, man? There's this sort of fundamental disconnect between ideas within the UFO community.
Right. But what's so interesting though is that in other fields you have this diametric opposition as well. I'll never forget this. I did a class on naturalism, and the professor that gave it was very focused on the idea of, or very interested, I shouldn't say focused, but interested in the idea that language is a extension of our cognitive function. And so the way we think relates to the way that we act or do and speak. And so that's how language came about. And so language is a very powerful way of dissecting the brain's functions and things, right? Kind of a kind of Sellers-esque kind of view of things. And then in that same class, though, there were about 6 of us, and I'm over there writing papers about witchcraft and aliens and crap. And there was another colleague of mine, or classmate, I guess you should say, writing about how all of this naturalism stuff is a big bunch of bull crap and it's all metaphysics, and we managed to get through a whole semester of reading each other's papers without tearing each other apart. That level of, I guess, academic, the way I look at it is, I trusted that other classmate of mine made that argument from a place of good faith. She legitimately believed that, and she had reasons to suppose those things that she said, even though I don't agree with them. She was coming from a place of good faith. And there are people in the UFO field who I think have that same view, right? I don't necessarily agree with Jacques Vallée's, statements or ideas about this subject, but I don't doubt that he is coming from a rigorous place of academic knowledge. But there is no control of that in the UFO community. So, you can have people like Corey Good say, I've been to Mars, and you know what I mean?
Right.
There doesn't seem to be any kind of control of that does exist in other academic fields. And it's just, why hasn't there been that? Do they not? Do people
I think
not
there's a few
it?
things. I mean, I think fundamentally the first thing you have to deal with is that UFOs are like religious in a way, right? It is a huge aspect of it is based upon faith. And once you dive into the realm of belief, what people believe in, right? Suddenly they're going to have some bias, and there's going to be, definitely like cognitive bias. And anything that disagrees with their beliefs is automatically heresy, right? And they're not going to argue with it in a rigorous or a method of using evidence. They're just going to tear the person apart because they don't want to hear it anymore, right? It's the famous case of Saint Nicholas. This is something no one knows about Saint Nicholas. He apparently delivered toys like to poor children and money to poor children, but the way he ended arguments with heretics is he punched them square in the face. So he didn't argue with them in a rigorous way. He just basically shut them up by hitting them. And I think that's kind of how the UFO community kind of reacts. There's that gut reaction of, you're not on my side, therefore I'm not going to listen to you anymore. And that's it. They shut them out. From the academic idea, or the sort of the collegial atmosphere of academia versus, UFO community. I think the first thing is the vast majority of people within the UFO community aren't academics. But the other idea is, I think most academics will believe, or maybe believe is the wrong word. Most academics will take a position, right? Like I've done this. I've taken a position in various, papers regarding subculture and whatever, but always with the kind of background understanding in the back of my head, that pragmatic place in my head. It's like, I could be wrong here because another academic could prove me wrong. Because there is something to rest.
Absolutely.
There is something to rest proof upon, right? So if suddenly my worldview and my theory begins to change or shift, I don't necessarily get angry. I just kind of go, yeah, well, listen, his evidence or her evidence is better than mine. Maybe they do have something there, and I'm willing to adopt aspects of their philosophy, of their background, of their evidence into my world to kind of alter my interpretation, right? When I first walked into the UFO community, I was very much a person who was like, I'm if I had to hedge my bet and kind of say, let's say UFOs are real, just for like the sake of argument. Let's say, it's a real phenomenon. I'm going to go with the fact that it's aliens because that's what I've been told, right? Like everyone talks about how it's aliens from another planet. This makes the most sense. There's billions and billions and billions and billions of galaxies out there. Surely life must exist elsewhere. Therefore, it's probably, nuts and bolts, ET. My philosophy has since changed, right? I've had plenty of time to reflect and think about this, and I've kind of begun to lean towards the more Valléan, Keelian approach to the phenomenon. Whether I'm right or wrong, I don't know. Like, I also personally don't care, because at some point, hopefully, somebody's going to prove me wrong. and I'll accept it. But it's just your interpretation changes, but with the constant understanding that you very well could be wrong, so don't rest on your laurels too much.
What's another aspect, another part of it, I guess, that I think is kind of interesting is, and here's the thing too, I don't think that we should I don't want to belabor the point that academic collegiality or whatever even really exists in some cases. Like, I have seen grown men shout at each other at a conference over the calculation of a pipe diameter. You know what I mean? Like, that doesn't necessarily always happen. So, there's heat everywhere. Yeah. One of the big challenges that I think some of us have faced, I know you've gotten heat for this, I have certainly gotten heat for this, a lot of people asking questions of To the Stars Academy, their relationship with Bigelow, all of it have gotten heat for this, is the idea that when this information comes around again, when the cycle happens and the same stories happen, or these people show up again who have been discredited in the past, or whatever, right? When something comes back around, what's interesting in the UFO field that I don't think necessarily happens in other fields is they are given almost a fresh, a clean
holy
slate.
Crap. I mean, listen, oh my God. Yeah. I mean, the fact that Bob Lazar is a thing again is to me, now that's not TCSA's fault, but I don't understand how we've already gone down this road. It's well trodden. The data's kind of in. And then suddenly you have this whole new generation of people in the community who are now getting this new set of data regarding Mr. Lazar, but it's not really new. It's just kind of been rebranded. And they're kind of buying it, right? Or they walk around with this kind of like, maybe it is true, like we can't write it off totally. And it's like, well, no, we kind of can, but, because we have already.
Right, it's happened. We have the info. To me, it reminds me of, and the one, like Lazar is a great example of this. Another one, the one that drives me crazy personally is Pudov, but we're going to get into that on my episode here coming up soon. It's almost as if Jose Canseco, someone decided to do a documentary on Jose Canseco now and just focus on all the good stuff, right? Oh, home runs and everything else and whatever, and not mention at all any of the steroid stuff, and then people be like, no, like all that, we already did this. It's not true. None of it's true. And then being like, shut up, chill, stupid government, man.
Yeah, I think it's tough, right? Because like I said earlier, right? There's a huge belief component to UFOs. There's definitely a spiritual, religious aspect, right? So people have a fundamental desire to want whatever their belief system is to sort of be like ratified as true. So I think that's a really big problem, I think, within the UFO community, because we need to take a step back and just say, listen, whether they're real or not, fine. We can debate the physics. We can debate maybe some of the cultural pieces, but we can't necessarily debate your belief system, right? If you walk in with a preconceived notion, it becomes very difficult to have a reasonable conversation, because at one point, like, you're going to get offended or I'm going to get offended. And then the conversation's going to end, right? And we just start yelling at each other. And Lazar or any other, well-trodden paths ufologically that have already kind of been thoroughly disproven. Once people bring them back, you suddenly have a whole bunch of new people starting to believe again, right? So now we have a whole bunch of believers in Lazar who are not going to necessarily approach it from a bird's eye view. They're going to approach it from their belief space. And it's also really, to Mr. Corbell's credit, he's a very good sort of marketer. He's a very good user of social media. So he's very good at the messaging component and the marketing component of this. Not so much as at maybe the critical aspects. The fact that, Mr. Lazar's criminal record and his shady business dealings, didn't come up very often in the film, or were they sort of quickly glossed over in the film compared to the rest. we need to kind of hit home this idea that Mr. Lazar has a long history of very shady business dealings that would verge on, being a confidence artist.
Right. It's just they're
but people don't hear that, right? People want to hear the UFO bit, right? I don't want to hear that he married the same woman twice under a different name, right? I don't want to hear that the day after the day of basically of his first wife's suicide, they moved into her house immediately. They don't want to hear about the brothel. They don't want to hear about his business dealings with Mr. Bigelow and defrauding Mr. Bigelow. Right? They don't want to hear about
and Bigelow being
right. They don't want to hear about that. Right. They don't want to hear about that. What do you do? Right. I mean. So if they don't want to hear that, they're not going to go down that road with you.
Part of me wonders if, so I always liken it. And again, I actually, frankly, I don't know all that much about Canada's cultural history.
It's not very good.
So a lot of this comes.
We were jerks. But...
Well, listen, man, United States,
win, yeah.
Come on. I was going to say we win. It's still not great here. But one of the interesting things to me is how similar this seems like in the United States, the history of religious movements reforming themselves in a way that is to the point where they are, evangelical religious organizations, right? And again, nothing against those kinds of religious beliefs, whatever you believe what you want, but by not having that kind of central control of almost peer review that the Roman Catholic Church, let's say, has, you end up with these smaller splinter groups that introduce all kinds of things that maybe would not be able to exist in a place with more careful control. So you have religious groups in the United States who believe that the earth is 6,000 years old, or that dinosaurs and man existed, cohabitated together, or anything else. To me, the UFO field is very similar to that. And, in my mind, part of the reason that has happened is because of a lack of a central, I guess, leadership or a place, and in my mind, that's what MUFON was always
this
supposed
is in my
to
book. The UFO world, let's say the UFO discourse, let's call it that, doesn't have an ivory tower, right? There's no governing body that has established itself to sort of be, we decide what, who's a ufologist based upon credentials, based upon behavior, based upon following the rules, whatever. So yeah, there is no pope of ufology, let's say, and there's no leadership. It is a free for all. It's a total anarchy. And there's positives to that and there's negatives to that. But what you bump into is because there's no central control, there's no governing agency that issues licenses and can remove them or whatever. Anyone can say whatever they want. And that if they have enough people in their corner, they have enough followers, right? Their message becomes, fundamentally huge, and it becomes a massive gong in right now, a chorus of sort of little voices. We often refer to sort of Jacques Vallée's notion of the invisible college, right? And these are, people that we sort of have heard of: Gary Nolan, Kit Green, Hal Puthoff. There's obviously others, Jacques Vallée himself. Hynek was in it back when he was still alive. But you had this loose collection, these sort of confederacies of these little pockets of academics who were engaged in sort of the UFO study. But they didn't really cohabitate with the rest of the UFO community, right? They sort of remained separate. They sort of didn't like it, right? So they kind of removed themselves and hung out with themselves and did their own thing. And they were very lucky to receive funding. I mean, Bob Bigelow was heavily involved in that group of individuals. And they had friends in high places. But then on the flip side, right, you could probably say someone like David Wilcock, is a very powerful figure within at least he was a very powerful figure within sort of UFO discourse in the last 5 years. He had millions of followers. His books were like bestsellers. So his word for literally like 200,000 or 300,000 subscribers to his YouTube channel was massive, and it had significant sway and force. And To the Stars is very much kind of, taken that mantle a little bit. The last 2 years has very much seen To the Stars become a massive force within the UFO discourse, right? They have a loud voice, and you're going to kind of see these sort of loud voices pop up, and then they kind of go away, and then someone else takes their place who has a lot of followers, and then they kind of go away. And then there's the rest of us, right? There's sort of these one-offs like you and me, and we have our little community that we talk to, and we sort of have our own little locus of influence, I suppose, or we work with other people. And everyone's kind of just trying to do their own thing, I guess, in the UFO community. There's no one who can say, this is law, right? And MUFON was another voice, right? I think MUFON had significant street cred, in the 80s and 90s. It had street cred, I think, in the early 2000s, but I think that street cred has since sort of waned. I think you've had, leadership in MUFON that hasn't exactly been the best. I think there's been a lot of scandals in the last decade from MUFON that have really weakened its position. Field investigation numbers, numbers of field investigators are going down. MUFON membership is going down because people are no longer flocking to it as a major voice anymore. It's being replaced. And there's a lot of reasons, I think, for this. But it's also just part of how this community exists. Things sort of come and go. Hynek's QFOS was, that was the thing to be in, right? In the 60s. Right. And it's gone, right? I mean, predominantly gone. To the point where I'm sure you could go on Twitter and like ask people in the UFO community what QFOS is, and they'd have no idea what you're talking about. They never heard of it.
Right. Well, that's I think, to me, the most fascinating part of a lot of this is because of that lack of a central repository for this knowledge, a lot of it gets lost. MUFON's numbers are dwindling because, frankly, MUFON members are dying. They're an old crowd. So I think it's such a shame to have, then there's a couple of people trying to do this kind of archival work, right? Isaac Coy is one that comes to mind, trying to bring this old kind of information to make it available, to digitize it, to have it available online. But it just seems like such I guess the frustration for me is I feel like I have learned a lot by talking to people and reading stuff from, say, people like you and, others, where like I feel like I have learned more about this subject and have been able to discard some old ideas that I had. That it's possible to do that. It's possible to learn something about UFOs, but a lot of people aren't doing that because it happens at their own pace. I mean, number one, obviously, of course, right, like with anything, but there also is there's no single place to get good information, or there is no, like you said, kind of ivory tower or college or anything else. And I don't even know if there necessarily should be. I guess I would just like to see more of, I think that in general, there are more people like us involved who want to have kind of information like that available and who would have their minds changed by evidence to the contrary of something, then there are kind of more of the rabid, all or nothing people.
Well, that's a big part of it, right? And that plays again to the belief idea, right? There's all these people who walk around and they are all or nothing. You either play for our team or you don't. And unfortunately, that's not how the real world is, right? I mean, you have to be pragmatic in this world because the vast majority of data in this world is totally made up and it's just total crap. So you can't be all or nothing in this universe. It's just not possible. You always have to retain that bit of pragmatism to just say, you know what, like it's really interesting, and I think this is a really great idea, and I hope it turns out to be true. But I'm also not going to throw in 100%, because what if it's not, right? Like, let's talk about this arts parts thing, right? There's been a lot of discussion about these Linda Moulton Howe pieces that TTSA recently acquired, and there's been a lot of rumor and hearsay. There's been a lot of talk that initial tests have verified that the isotopic ratios of this material it proves that it's not from Earth or something. And it's like, okay, listen, that's great, and I personally really hope that's true. Like, that would be fundamentally life changing for our species if suddenly we found metal that was not from here. Like, I want that to be the case. But my wanting that to be the case does not make it the case, right? Nor does my believing it to be the case make it the case. You're entitled to have your desires and your beliefs and your wants, and you're entitled to have your opinions, and that's fine. But you're not entitled to have your own facts. And until those facts come out, right? Until peer-reviewed papers come out that like actually say, yeah, listen, we've had this stuff tested in 8 different labs, all verified the same findings. This is something unique. Then we can be excited. Then we can get worked up and maybe be like, okay, well, let's, why is it like this? Why is the metal different? Let's go down these more theoretical and speculative roads now. But right now, we don't have anything. I mean, we have a few bits of metal that currently have a value of $35,000. Like I said, I mean, for Mr. DeLong, $35,000, I'm sure isn't very much money, but we need to, as you sort of expertly put in the article, what are we paying for here, in a sense, right? Are we paying for the metal, or are we paying for what the belief that metal possesses, right? The history.
Yeah. And I think one of the challenges here with that analysis too is what constitutes verifiable proof of something like that is going to be different for different people. And it's one of the things that we try to touch on, or I try to touch on in an article that I wrote for Open Minds UFO, the website, where, right, if a layman, if I showed you an SEM photo of what aluminum being oxidized in air looks like under a microscope, you would see that it appears to be composed of perfect hexagons that appear to have had to have been engineered. Right. Do you know what I mean? They look too perfect to just have been naturally growing that way. But no, in fact, nature is lazy and loves patterns. And so crystals tend to grow in structures of that kind of sort, right? So even evidence that a layperson might consider to be evidence of engineering, unless proven to have some purpose, might not be engineered. And even then, it might not be engineered. There has to be a preponderance of evidence to make this claim. And I've said from the beginning continuously, I really hope that Tom DeLonge proves me to be a stupid idiot. Yeah. Like, I would love. Are you kidding me? Yeah. It would be awesome if this is if we have a piece of material that we can shoot terahertz, light waves at, to then generate a gravitational field of some sort. Holy crap, man. Yeah. We're going to have jetpacks, hoverboards. Yeah. It's going to be awesome. I would be thrilled if that was the case. But at the same time, you have to, I don't know, it'd be awesome, but you need to couch that in what do we know so far? And what have they given us? And what do we know about the material to begin with? This is a piece of material that has a storied history in the UFO community. Man. So
sorry, I was going to just to sort of jump in. It's like I agree with you, right? I want this to be so true because it would be the best. But there's no one's asking anybody to like buy in outright and just throw their cards in and just be a believer, right? Like, nowhere does it say sort of in life that you need to like believe someone outright. And like, I'm trying to word this properly. to the stars does not necessarily need you to put them on some pedestal and worship the ground they walk on, right? They're going to do what they're going to do, and they're going to engage in their work and their studies and their programs and whatever, and good or ill, they're going to do it. They don't need people to cheer them on. Like they just don't care, right? They just really, they just don't care. They're just going to do their thing. And what we need to be cognizant of is when they start making claims of truth when the evidence is still out, right? So when they announce via press release that they obtain sort of exotic metamaterials, as someone who works now in the journalism field, I decided, well, listen, they're making a truth claim. They're saying we are in possession of exotic metamaterials that, are potentially otherworldly. That's a big claim to make. So we need to talk about this. So I wrote an article about it, kind of being like, well, let's look at it realistically here. Is this actually, what do they actually have? And obviously the follow-up was the second piece, but we need to kind of keep the critical, we have to keep the feet to the fire a little bit and be critical and remain critical. It's not bad to be critical. I don't think criticism is tantamount to rebellion and hatred. Just because you're critical of something doesn't mean you hate it. You're just trying to keep people honest. And I hope the next article I write is, yep, there you go. They just confirmed it, and Oxford University and Cambridge and Harvard have all gotten behind them, and everyone's confirming this. Yes, it's from Zeta Reticuli. How great would that be?
Yeah, it'd be amazing. I mean, one of the biggest things that I really wanted to get to with this series was give people the context of this group to the Stars Academy, because it has been very frustrating to go onto shows or even this podcast, let's say, or on Twitter or whatever, and discuss these things. There's so much history there that it is nearly impossible to expect people to know all of it.
Right.
It's, to know the history, to be able to form an opinion on modern, say, Chinese trade policy, you don't need to know the history of China all the way back to like the Han Dynasty. But it feels that way. It feels that way in the UFO world because a lot of these same people have been doing this for so long. So right. I guess as a closing thought here, if you were to introduce people to this subject, or if you were to suggest to people about, when they're learning about To the Stars Academy or when they're looking at these articles and things, what do you suggest they look into first to get that kind of background?
Well,
it's hard. I know it's a hard question.
I think you mean, you've really created this perfect way for me to say something stupid and then get yelled at on Twitter. So we're gonna proceed with caution. I would say this. I would say we need to look first at the history of definitely the people involved, and I don't mean Tom DeLonge. I honestly think Tom DeLonge's a bit of an innocent in all this. I think he's just really into UFOs, and he was able to somehow muster together these men who have been perceived as being the insiders, and in some ways potentially have been insiders into sort of this odd little world of special access programs and intelligence organizations and whatever. So, I don't think Tom DeLonge is necessarily the biggest fish to fry here. Let's put it that way. I'd love to meet the guy. I'd love to interview him. I'd love to sit down with him. So Tom, if you're listening, blah, 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 you can find my email. But the interesting part that we need to look at is the connections between the 1970s Stanford Research Institute and how Hal Puthoff and Kit Green were involved in that study, how that ties into sort of the current military and private industry that is engaged in creating weapons and manufacturing within sort of government programming. You need to look at how these gentlemen were involved in ufology in the 1980s during literally the decade of perhaps the most galvanizing of ideologies within the UFO world. I mean, like the 1980s was really when I think modern ufology kind of that we have today really began. Like I think we can talk about 1947 and all that, and that was definitely kind of 70 years ago was definitely the sort of the seed was planted. But I think really the roots of modern UFO discourse really began in the 80s. And that's when we sort of see the huge rise of stuff like alien abductions, the huge rise of hybrid programs, the huge rise of crashed objects, you know, in various deserts being collected and secured. Those myths sort of always existed, but they weren't as prevalent as they are now. You know what I mean? Like the 1980s saw that explode into sort of modern UFO discourse as being really the key ideas of it, and their involvement in that. I mean, they all still worked together at that time. There was a sort of invisible college that existed. Vallée was a part of it. Puthoff was a part of it. Green was a part of it. You know, you would have had Russell Targ and a few others, but they all kind of fundamentally did the same thing. You know, and then into the 90s, into the 2000s. You know, they kind of still operated, right? And they really set about a lot of our current ufological discourse. The problem is, you know, while I appreciate them, they hold their cards very close to their chest. They don't share a lot. So when they do share, the UFO community kind of grabs onto that information. And it's a piece. It's never like a whole like thing. It's like these little snippets of data, and then we kind of spin out with it, right? We start spreading our own disinformation or misinformation because we don't have the rest of the puzzle, and we start going down conspiracy roads and, you know, whatever. The point is, you need to really start in the 70s, I think, and how Russell Targ, Kit Green, and how Puthoff met, and then how it kind of spread throughout the rest of UFO discourse. They've really kind of been the creators of it in a sense. They've at least played a role in its creation, the mythology that we have. As for the other people into the stars like Chris Mellon and Luis Elizondo, I have no idea how they got involved in this mess. You know, like that's sort of still the big mystery to me. Like I don't know Chris Mellon's story very well. I mean, I know his background, I know who he is, but I don't really know how he got involved in this community.
Yeah, Mellon, I think, and Mellon and Semivan are big question marks for me as well. It's kind of like, well,
yeah,
what
we can. I mean,
happened there?
We can draw some lines. Like I think I know when Mellon and Elizondo would have met, or at least where their paths would have crossed in a certain government agency. Like you can kind of start as you kind of dig deeper into their past military or intelligence history, right, where they used to work. You kind of start to see these connections of like, okay, interesting. They used to work for like the National Geographic Intelligence Agency or whatever it was together for a few years, or Mellon oversaw it and then Elizondo was employed there, or Elizondo's partner was employed there. You know what I mean? And you can kind of maybe start seeing the web form, but it's not really sure.
Yeah, it is hard to pull them. No, it's hard to pick. I mean, that's one thing with our series now is we're trying to figure out the same kind of thing, right? Where did, for instance, Puthoff and Bigelow first meet? That's a challenge to figure out. We have some suggestions, right? I think there's some good anecdotal evidence to say exactly where that happened. You know, even say Harry Reid and Bigelow, we found, it seems pretty cut and dry how they met initially, but then you have Harry Reid in an interview saying, well, no, we didn't really know each other then, whatever. With these other groups, I actually wonder, and this is going to sound kind of crazy, I think, John Alexander, I don't know how much of this story you know. John Alexander, one of the kind of people that he worked with, or worked under rather, in the Army, became what was known at the time as the corporate world's first corporate shaman. He was this guy that kind of, all of those joke characters in shows like say Silicon Valley are modeled after this guy who would he was in the Army, or he was in the military rather. He wrote this book about creating essentially like a military force of psychics who could deflect bullets and like Neo or whatever. So he was very involved with Puthoff and SRI and John Alexander, when they were working on kind of these esoteric military concepts and the men who stare at goats and everything. And actually, this guy is one of the main characters who was adapted into the men who stare at goats. But anyways, this guy, though, became like, he would go to these corporations and do these talks about, opening your inner eye and using it to make business decisions and everything else. And we know that in the 90s, Bigelow was having people like that come talk at Bigelow Aerospace, and that it was leading to these kind of big things where like Harry Reid went to some of these to go see people like this. I actually almost wonder if that's not also how Chris Mellon got involved, and even Steve Justice, let's say, that they saw these people at these corporate events and were just that's kind of, you know what I mean? Like people meet each other in weird ways, but we can't. Yeah, it's so hard to pin down, which is frustrating.
Like, I don't want to use this term because it sounds negative, but it's all sort of, it's very incestuous, right? And I don't mean that in a negative way. It's a small group of people they introduce like their friends to the group, right? It's like being with the popular kids, right? You can never really get in unless you're introduced because, like, it turns out you're cool. So there's that. There's that weird, like they kind of meet each other and then they meet this other guy and then he gets brought in, right? Like, I totally agree with you. That's most likely how it all played out, right? They just sort of had very similar interests. They had similar ideas of the universe and how it operated. And they just kind of became buddies. I mean, it's interesting. Like, it helps, I think, that a lot of them are sort of very financially well off because the realistic, situation here is none of this stuff is ever going to get funded properly, right? It all has to be done sort of privately through private funding, through just quiet donors who have an extra couple mil to throw around, so they do because they're interested, right? And that's fine. Like, you know what, man? Like, listen, if Robert Bigelow wants to throw money into this, great, go nuts. But it's just, we obviously need to be cognizant of what starts to happen, though, is when you start introducing just your friends into the circle, it sometimes becomes a bit of an echo chamber, right? Yeah. You all start kind of looking at the same thing, you start hunting the same thing in the same way. And yeah, I mean, you're just going to get more people like you to come in.
Yeah, you spit out the same ideas in different kind of ways. Yeah, well, there's also a part of this story that we're going to talk about on our show, but it never gets brought up really, is that if you're rich, people just assume you're smart and your ideas are good. Jeffrey Epstein managed to have the world's best scientist go to his mansion to talk about creating a clone army of him, essentially. Like, if you have money, people will listen to you, even if you're dumb as hell. That's just what happens. Not to say any of these people are dumb as hell involved in this, but that's a known phenomena. It's not hard. Man, MJ, thank you so much for coming on, man. Thanks for taking time out of your time with your family to talk to us. Any last ideas? Any last thoughts? Things you want people to know about or hear about?
No. Thanks very much for having me on your show. This was great. If people want to go and read more of my work, they can go to Vice and look me up, or they can go to my Twitter account at MJ Banias. They can go to my YouTube channel. They can buy my book, The UFO People, Curious Culture, on Amazon. That's kind of where everything is. I would say from a strictly just, moving forward, I think just retaining critical thinking and kind of being cognizant of the fact that, if it sounds too good to be true, it most likely is, and just, you don't have to buy in. Let's put it that way. I think that's what I need to walk away from, right? You don't need to buy in outright just to be supportive of something. You don't need to buy in outright to want something to be the case. You can just be pragmatic in your outlook, right? It's okay to, be like, maybe not. Doesn't really matter. I'm just going to enjoy my beer. That's all you got. That's my approach, I think. And I kind of wish people would kind of take that approach sometimes.
Well, I think one of the best parts of this, or one of my favorite quotes that you used as well on Twitter, right? The truth is like a lion. You don't have to defend it. Let it loose. Yes. It will defend itself, from St. Augustine. 100% correct. All right. Well, MJ, thanks so much again for coming on. Listeners, go check out MJ Banias. Look for it on Vice. Look for him on Twitter. Look for his YouTube channel, too. A lot of great content there. And check out the book, too, The UFO People. Super fun. All right. Thanks again for listening to the Mad Scientist Podcast. We will be back next week with another episode. Thank you again, dear listeners, for listening to the Mad Scientist Podcast. I have been your host, Chris Cogswell, joined by my co-host,
Marie Mayhew.
If you'd like to contact the show, please send us an email at themadscientistpodcast@gmail.com. That's all one word. You can also follow us on Twitter at Mad Scientist Pod or at Team Giant Squid for Marie. And of course, you can see us on Facebook, on Instagram, and all over the internet as the Mad Scientist Podcast. And again, our logo is the one with the pumpkin head, so it's easy to see.
Mm-hmm.
If you've enjoyed the show tonight, please consider supporting us on Patreon, where the money that you give to us will help us to promote this show further, to make it better, and just to spend more time making it.
Yes, we love doing that.
We do love doing that. Our logo was designed by Carrie Shaheen. Our web design is done by Desdemona Howard.
Woohoo!
And our sound design is done by Jake Cardinal. Thanks again for listening.
Thank you. This has been a Damn It Chippy production.